When we look at ancient Egyptians, they are flanked by two African groups, the North Africans and the East Africans. And their DNA varies a little bit, but you will notice that they always have a sub-Saharan African component, especially the further back you go. So let's compare these two areas.
The region of North Africa is incredibly old. As a matter of fact, one of the oldest human fossils, if not the oldest human fossil, the Jebel El Hood skull, which dates back to more than 300,000 years ago, was found in Morocco. And over here we've got a reconstruction of the Jebel El Hood skull. The first people who impacted the Moroccan genome are known as the Ibero-Maurusians. And over here we've got a reconstruction of an Ibero-Maurusian man as well as an Ibero-Maurusian woman.
I have no problem with his account of Ibero-Maurusian, except the reconstruction that he's making is a guess. And we know that Ibero-Maurusians had sub-Saharan DNA as well as North African DNA. Now, we don't know if these are a coming together of two groups or just one group that used to be sub-Saharan African in component. But you will see as the video goes on that there's an increase of lighter skin human beings. So the Ibero-Maurusians could have just been a dark skin, like black African people that later got foreign components in themselves.
Guys have existed in North Africa for more than 20,000 years, and we know that they are related to the indigenous people of Morocco because we found human remains in caves all across North Africa. Around 30% of the Amazigh genome is derived from the Ibero-Maurusians. But if we look up here,
that part is very interesting because you would expect that if they remained unique to the region, that they would have a way higher component of this Ibero-Maurusian, and the breakdown of the DNA should be Ibero-Maurusian and sub-Saharan African DNA, and that's it. If they were directly related to the Ibero-Maurusians and had no outside components. But let's continue to watch.
in northern Moroccans, Anatolian Neolithic farmer. Around 40% of their DNA is derived from these Anatolian Neolithic farmers. Why is this DNA component so high? Anatolian farmers were one of the first farmers in the world, and as a matter of fact, it's through them that farming spread into Europe, and we've got reconstructions of Anatolian Neolithic farmers. Around 5,000 years ago, they make their way into North Africa, and for this reason, we see a very high...
This DNA I could accept as the first foreign DNA in North Africans, but I will also say that there is no proof that this DNA was present in sub-Saharan, in North Africa as early as he says. It is present in modern Africans, but we don't know if it represents the old Africans, especially since we've seen that older Africans had a higher component of sub-Saharan DNA.
Elevation of Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, but it wasn't just the Anatolian farmers that brought about this DNA component. The Capsians were a Neolithic group that expanded into North Africa close to 8,000 years ago. And what's interesting about the Capsians is that they had a very large component of West Asian derived admixture.
Again, I agree with his breakdown. It's just the reconstructions that I disagree with. It seems like the European type appearance is not as strong back in the day.
We also had the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians originated in the Levant, and they made migrations all across North Africa. As a matter of fact, they formed one of the most formidable empires, the Empire of Carthage, which spanned all across North Africa. They were Phoenician in origin, they spoke Canaanite, and they themselves had a very high Anatolian Neolithic DNA component. But we've also got...
You see, this is why I said what I said before, because this Neolithic DNA and the other parts of the DNA could have just come from these people, admixture with the Romans and the Phoenicians and all these other people who came in later, and now is being interpreted as ancient, when it would have been ancient in people who came from other regions. later.
But other events, such as the Reconquista, for 800 years, Spain was under Muslim rule. But after a certain time period, the Christians repel all the Muslims and all the Muslim Spaniards. Many of them flee to North Africa. And this is why when we look into DNA tests of people like Moroccans, we actually see a very high component of Iberian DNA. We see a lot of Spanish DNA amongst many groups. Over here, I've got an Amazigh DNA result, and he's got close to 25% Iberian DNA.
So again, a second foreign population. First, the early people of the Italy, Greco-Roman area, and they added their component, which would significantly change the skin color and the general appearance of the North Africans. And then the second component from Europe, and not to mention that there were slaves that were being brought back into Europe that were favored by North Africans because of their light skin.
So we just discussed the two major DNA components of the Amazigh, but if we look at this DNA breakdown, we also see close to 10% of their DNA is derived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. How on earth did that happen? Because the Pontic-Caspian steppe is very characteristic of European DNA. I've got a map here of steppe admixture, and we see that it peaks in Northern Europe, but we also see low frequencies here in Morocco. This is very odd because the Indo-Europeans who originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe didn't migrate to North Africa. They colonized the entire Eurasian plateau, but they didn't migrate into North Africa. So why on earth did this happen? Well, we just established that when the Reconquista happened in Spain, many Spanish Muslims were expelled back into North Africa. Spaniards themselves have close to 30% Indo-European DNA. So this is one of the reasons. Another one of the reasons is in Iberia, there were a lot of slaves that were Slavic in origin. And when the Reconquista happened, they were expelled back into North Africa. But also, we had the establishment of the Vandal kingdom. The Vandals were people who originated in southern Poland. They were a Germanic group. And after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, they actually formed a kingdom in North Africa known as the Vandal kingdom. So these guys all contributed to this Indo-European DNA that we see amongst the Amazigh people. And it ranges anywhere between 5 to 10%.
So as you can see, that's pretty significant amounts. 3 different groups of European and Middle Eastern DNA that seem to be foreign to the region, and of course must have changed the phenotype of the natives, no matter what you think they were before. And so, given this, it must follow that the North Africans have changed dramatically, especially given the fact that they had a very large sub-Saharan component, which he's about to talk about.
Now, the last DNA component that makes up the sort of Amazigh genome, the last major component is that of West African, or should I say sub-Saharan African admixture. And there are several reasons to this. I previously described the Ibero-Maurusians as being the first people in North Africa, but when we do genomic testing, we actually find out that the Ibero-Maurusians themselves were derived from 2 ancestral populations. Around 70 to 80% of their genome was derived from a source that was related to the Natufians, and the Natufians were one of the first people to discover farming. They weren't directly related to the Natufians, but they were related to a proto-Natufian source. Whilst around 20 to 30% of the DNA was derived from a group that had genetic similarities with modern-day sub-Saharan Africans.
Like I showed last time on my DNA breakdown of North Africa, you can see that the North Africans had a significant amount of sub-Saharan African, which he explains. And of course, the sub-Saharan DNA has to be more ancient than the Natufian. But the Natufian DNA just seems to be a back migration of black Africans back into Africa, because it's not that long ago from the original expansion. Also, it doesn't seem to be that significantly different than other places, but I'll show you that later.
This is one of the reasons. The other reason is the slave trade routes actually went through North Africa.
The funny part is, even given the slave trade route, a lot of North Africans have no high component of sub-Saharan DNA. Most of their DNA seems to be higher when it comes to other populations. But you will notice that the Natufians and the other North Africans from long time ago that have been genetically tested had a higher component of sub-Saharan DNA than modern ones, meaning that there was a shedding of sub-Saharan DNA no matter how you slice it. Even if you believe that the Natufians were lily white and 30% of the DNA of the North Africans back then was sub-Saharan African DNA, as the DNA suggests, it means that there was a shedding of a black component in modern North Africans.
Also, just from a geographic perspective, North Africa has very close geographic proximity to sub-Saharan Africa, and as a matter of fact, this is a Tuareg. The Tuaregs are an Amazigh group in the southern regions of North Africa. I think you can also find them in Mali. As we can see from his features, he looks black. So yeah, this sub-Saharan African DNA varies amongst different Amazigh populations. When we go to the Moroccans of the north, I'm using the Moroccans as a benchmark here. Northern Moroccans have like 7%, while southern Moroccans have like up to 24% sub-Saharan African derived admixture.
Now this part is a little bit confusing because this Tuareg DNA that's considered, or this sub-Saharan admixture that's 24%, should not necessarily be considered foreign to the region, because of course this quote-unquote sub-Saharan African DNA can also be found in Libya, in high places, and of course in Libya there's all kinds of people who are black Berbers. There are black Berbers in North Africa, and in fact a lot of people have suggested that the Berbers and the Moors were black African, and then they had other people move in, but they kept the name Moor. And the word Moor is thought to have come from the word Mauritania, which the word Mauritania means black. One Greek author that I read last time said that the Moors get their name from their skin color.
Common misconception amongst many people is that the Amazigh are Arabs, and this is not necessarily the case because the Amazigh have their own ethnic identity. As a matter of fact, when we look into Amazigh DNA, we don't actually see that much Arab-derived admixture. And I've actually got a 23andMe result of a Amazigh person who did a DNA test on 23andMe, and they've only got like 3% Arabic DNA from the Arabian Peninsula. This is in contrast to a Moroccan Arab, because there are Arabs in Morocco, who has up to 17% Arabic-derived admixture, which is interesting. So this implies that the Amazigh people have maintained genetic continuity despite the countless number of conquests that have occurred in North Africa. And I'm going to pull up a PCA chart. A PCA chart is a principal component analysis chart. It tells us how similar populations are to one another. Over here is a PCA chart of the Gaunch people. And the Gaunch people were the indigenous people of the Canary Islands. And they're actually used as a proxy when we're investigating North African DNA. And over here we can see the Gaunches in green and red cluster very similar with the Tunisians and the Algerians, which implies that, despite many years of conquests, they've maintained onto their genetics. So guys,
the genetics of these people, of course, is still similar to what the original people would have looked like, but as you can see, there's a push away from sub-Saharan Africa in terms of phenotype and genetics, which to me proves that the sub-Saharan component was an earlier mix, not a later one. And even the later mix with the slaves was not that significant compared to the other DNAs that have been put in there, which means that we should expect the North Africans to look way lighter than they look today, especially if they started off light skin. If the North Africans started off with light skin, we would expect a lot of them to actually look more like Europeans. But in fact, they look like a halfway between halfway between Arabs and sometimes even Africans, East Africans.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Amina. So today I have my husband's DNA results. I actually looked at them, but he has no idea what his results are. So basically, for those of you guys that don't know, tell them where you're from.
I'm from Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, and which ethnicity?
So now we're going to look at East African DNA and his breakdown. But first, let's look at this DNA result so that we can get a context of what East Africans generally look like in terms of DNA and physical appearance.
Okay.
That's not mine.
Are you ready for your DNA?
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so you are
Yeah, go ahead. I'm waiting for
63.6%.
63?
63.6% East African.
I knew it.
You are less than 0.1% West African.
Oh my God.
You don't have no West African in you. I had 6% West African, so I'm more West African than you.
As you can see, the black component of Ethiopians and Somalians and people like that is not due to Nilo-Saharans or Bantu or West African component inside them. It's actually native to the region. And there's a population, the East African population, native East African population, that is this black breakdown. And as we saw with the North Africans, they also had a black component to them, probably bigger than what some people pretend it is, but we shall see.
And then you got 0.8% broadly sub-Saharan African, so they didn't know, just somewhere sub-Saharan.
Alright, okay.
And then you are 32.9%
Okay.
Middle Eastern and North African. And of that, you got 32.7% North African.
Wow. That's so nice, babe.
Yeah. Well, the North African could be Arab, because the North African.
So again, as I just showed you, the population that he encompasses, which means 90-something% of his DNA would be considered African if you count North African. And that shows you that the black DNA, which is very strong in this guy, is actually typical in Eastern Africa without an admixture of West or general sub-Saharan DNA, even with this back migration from the Levant or Middle East.
And you are 0.6% European.
0.0.
0.6.
0.6.
Maybe your eyebrow is European or something. It's so small.
Maybe my eyelash.
And then you have 2% unassigned. So 2% they have no idea what you are. So basically, you are 64%
Plus
sub-Saharan
32.
African and 32% North African. So 97% African.
As I said, if you count the North African, it would make him very highly African. But, of course, he's admixed as the North Africans are admixed. And as you can see, like I said, he is black and has very black features. So why is it that the people of East Africa have strong African DNA, especially when we consider what a lot of people say, that the languages that they speak in East Africa came from the Levant and that the peopling of East Africa came from the Levant? Clearly, the DNA of the people who first lived in that area must have been black, and this East African component is prevalent and existing in prehistoric and historic Egypt.
The country of Somalia is incredibly diverse. For example, when you go up in the northern regions of the country, people typically have higher levels of West Eurasian DNA. And when you go down to the south, you find higher levels of ancestral East African-related ancestry. What's really interesting about the Somali genome is that they're a combination of 2 West Eurasian sources and at least 3 distinct African populations. We're going to look at the Somali genome through a variety of different time periods to understand who they are from a genetic perspective. Over here, I've got a Stone Age DNA breakdown of the average Somali DNA. And interestingly, what we see is that 50% of their DNA is pre-Nilotic in origin.
Now, this is not a small point. The fact that they're pre-Nilotic, it means that the DNA of East Africans, even though it's Black African, is not necessarily due to a mixing with these Nilo-Saharans, the Dinka and all these other people who are like really black, but instead is an independent DNA that is black.
Now guys, the pre-Nilotic people were one of the first people to inhabit East Africa, and they contribute substantially to many Horn and East African populations. It peaks in the Mersey and Gumuz, but can be found all across East African populations. These pre-Nilotic people mixed with pre-existing groups that existed along the Omo River of Ethiopia. And that's why, when we look into the Somali genome, around 15% of their DNA is related to Omotic-related groups.
This is another important point, and like you can see, the Omotic people, who are an Afroasiatic people, are actually Black Africans. This is very important. Keep this in mind when you consider the fact that Afroasiatic has been considered coming from the Levant, when you can see that these groups here are actually Black African in origin.
The combination of this pre-Nilotic and Omotic genetic source sets the foundation for the sub-Saharan African component that's found in many Somalis. But if you look closely at this breakdown over here, what you see is that around 2% of their DNA is ancestral North African derived. Both North and East Africans have high prevalences of haplogroup E1b1, and E1b1 is theorized to have originated in the Horn. This
is a third important point, because if the E1b1 DNA originated in the Horn, and it is found in the Horn of Africa, and it is found in North Africa, this means that a Black people from North Africa spread throughout North Africa, and it's also found in Eurasia, and it spread to some parts of Eurasia. This means that the North Africans must have come, at least in part, from East Africans. But the sub-Saharan African DNA that I was showing you before in North Africans is mainly related to West Africans and Southern Africans. So you can see here that this is a different component of sub-Saharan DNA that has been entered into these North Africans. And again, it's very important that you figure out that it's thought to have come from the Horn of Africa. This is very important.
Indicates that there would have been a population that emerged out of East Africa, moving into the north of Africa. But then there were subsequent migrations back into the region from North Africa.
Now, this is the very, very important part, that this East African component that went into North Africa and then came back, it's important to imagine that this DNA that is partially Black or even wholly Black is moving both up and down into North Africa, into the Levant, and then coming back. Keep this in mind. It's very important. That means Black people went into Eurasia and then came back down, back into Ethiopia, carrying their language and everything else with them.
African component forms the first introduction of non-sub-Saharan African-related DNA that we see in the Somali. Around 2,000 years later, we start to see the spread of the Afroasiatic languages. And that's why today, the Somali language falls under the Cushitic branch of the Afroasiatic linguistic family. The first wave of Afroasiatic people to enter into Somalia were not Semitic in origin, but rather were Proto-Cushitic groups who lived around Mesopotamia, migrating down into Arabia and then subsequently into Somalia.
I was about to jump on him, but he fixed it. So the Omotic and the Cushitic and other people like that, we do know that they are the original Afroasiatic peoples, because we know the diversity of Afroasiatic languages are more common in Africa than they are. The Semitic branch means that Semitic, it's the one branch that is not African, or at least it's not African derived specifically, but it has its roots in Africa like all Afroasiatic languages. And so when he says this Afroasiatic group did a back migration, this is a group that came from Africa late, very late in history, went to the Levant, and then came back into Africa. Keep that in mind. A black group went up into Africa and then came back. The fact that we don't see another component of another language come back, but instead it's an African language that derived in Africa, tells you that these people are black Africans who went up and then back down. And you can see with this East African DNA that we showed that it was not mixed at all by this time, but instead was a purely sub-Saharan African DNA.
We know this because of the prevalence of haplogroup T, which originates somewhere in the Near East and the Caucasus. Today, haplogroup T can be found in high frequencies in certain Somali populations. These early people mixed with the local sub-Saharan African populations within the region. And that's why when we look at the Somali genome, around 25% of their DNA is Cushitic derived.
Now, even though he shows the Cushitic people being of Asian stock, Cushitic people are thought to be African. That's if you keep in mind, this word comes from this kingdom of Kush or whatever, which shows you the Africanness of it. So this is not a necessarily foreign DNA.
These early Afroasiatic migrations set the foundation for subsequent Afroasiatic people to migrate within the region. But subsequent migrations were next characterized by Semitic peoples, not Kushites, who had high prevalence of haplogroup J1.
So now he admits that the Kushites are African by saying that they were not the group that then came in, the J1 group that was a Semitic group, which, yes, there's some proof to show that a Semitic group then moved into East Africa. And of course, there's a lot of proof that other Semitic groups went into East Africa. That's why East Africans don't look exactly as black as they would have had they never been joined by other groups. But they look very black.
Haplogroup J1 peaks in all Semitic populations within the Horn of Africa, and today when we look at the Somali genome, around 8% of their DNA is specifically Semitic derived. This Semitic contribution does not only come from the Islamic expansions, but also can be attributed to the many Semitic empires that predated the Islamic expansions as well. Now, a question I get asked all the time is, are Somalis Arab? Somalis speak Somali, a Cushitic language, not an Arabic one, though Arabic is widely taught and spoken due to religious and historical ties. Culturally, Somalis have their own unique customs, traditions, poetry, and history that distinguish them from Arab cultures. However, due to the intertwined history, especially through trade and the spread of Islam, there have been cultural exchanges. Yes, there is a shared history and an overlap, especially with the Arabian Peninsula. But to label Somalis as Arab would be an oversimplification and overlooks the rich and diverse heritage that has shaped the Somali identity. If you've done an existing
has nothing to do with DNA. I would agree with him that the DNA of the East Africans being labeled Arab would be an oversimplification. But I also think that the DNA of the North Africans being labeled Semitic in origin is also a very simplified version of the truth. And as you can see, we've shown that there was sub-Saharan DNA that was higher before and was later joined by Eurasians and Europeans in general. So clearly the DNA of those people is not as simple. Now, to make matters worse, the Middle Eastern DNA, as you can see in this Ethiopian breakdown, is not as simple as you want it to be. People from the Horn of Africa went into the Middle East, and then they did a back migration into North Africa and East Africa again, meaning that it's a swamp which we cannot tell exactly who went where and why went and how come. So people who try to make it sound like people from the Mediterranean or from Saudi Arabia and those places were always light skinned, were always white, that's another oversimplification. The last group that we have not explored are the Nilo-Saharans, which seem to have been occupying the region of Northeast Africa forever, and they are obviously shown as ancient peoples in terms of the ancient Egyptians showing them. And think about these three groups that surround Egypt. You've got sub-Saharan African DNA to your North African. You've got sub-Saharan DNA to your East African. You've got sub-Saharan DNA with your Nilo-Saharans. These three coming together would have obviously put a high component on the ancient Egyptians, giving them a strong amount of sub-Saharan DNA, even if you think that they had a Semitic side to them. And of course, you saw that the migration would go through Egypt from Ethiopia, both pre and at the time of the Egyptians, and even a back migration back into Ethiopia. So it's obvious that the components of DNA in Egyptians must have been sub-Saharan African. And given their way they portray themselves as statues, I think the conclusion is obvious. Now, again, this does not mean they didn't have any Mediterranean DNA or Semitic DNA. In fact, at some point they would have. Maybe not the whole population, but a good chunk.